You know, William Shakespeare once famously asked, 20 watts or 100 watts? That is the question. What a question indeed. So whether you should buy like a 15 or 20 watt or even a 100 watt amp, it's a pretty easy question to answer. So if you're not sure on how loud of an amp you should buy, I got a few very basic questions that you gotta ask yourself, and however you answer those questions, that'll tell you exactly what you need. But just before we do that, we just need to first figure out how loud is loud. Why, you ask? Well, because the wattage of an amplifier isn't a true determination of how loud the amp is. Now, watts and decibels are actually two different things, and it's not a linear scale. So many would rightly think if you had a 20 watt amp versus a 100 watt amp, well, the 100 watt amp's going to be 5 times louder. But it doesn't actually work this way. If you're basing the output of an amplifier off of decibels, then the numbers completely change. In order for something to seem twice as loud as something else, it needs to be 10 decibels louder than the thing you're comparing it to. And when it comes to doubling the output wattage of an amplifier, you're actually only increasing by about 3 decibels. So a 50 watt amp is only 3 decibels louder than a 25 watt amp. A 100 watt amp is only about 3 decibels louder than a 50 watt amp. So if we look at a 20 watt amp versus a 100 watt amp, that's only about a 7 decibel increase in volume. So that's not even 10 decibels. So a 100 watt amp isn't even twice as loud as a 20 watt amp. And just to compare quickly, I'm going to drop the mic level down 7 decibel. So this would be our 20 watt amp cranked up, and then this would be our 100 watt amp cranked up. So then you got to be thinking, why the hell would I buy a 100 watter then when I can just get a 20 watter or a 15 watter? Ha ha ha, and this is where we get into the important stuff. The big difference between a 20 watt versus a 100 watt amp is going to be clean headroom. The more wattage the amp can put out, the more clean headroom it's going to have. And what I mean by clean headroom is how much volume can the power amp section push out before that section of the amp starts to distort and crap out. That's what we're talking about with clean headroom. Now you also have to look at the design of the amplifier itself, because that's also going to be a very determining factor in how much clean headroom that amplifier is going to have. So I mean, if you think back to like old plexis, that roar of an old plexi is a combination of the preamps, the power amp section, and the speakers all being... Totally lost my train of thought. All being driven to max. Whereas many modern amplifiers, especially multi-channel tube amps, they're designed so that you get all your distortion from overdriving the preamp section, but the power amp section is designed to be as clean as possible, so there's really no benefit to cranking them like an old plexi. So whether you should buy a 20 watt or 100 watt amp all boils down to one question. How much clean headroom do you need? And there's just 4 questions you gotta ask yourself. Well, I guess 3.5, because 2 of them kind of go hand in hand. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, how are you getting your distortion? So for example, if you're getting your distortion from a combination of overdriving the preamp section of the amp and the power amp section of the amp, in order to not have every sound guy you ever come across in your life try to kill you,
these go to 11.
Then a lower wattage amp might just be for you. This way you can drive the amp a hell of a lot harder without destroying the earbuds of anybody within a 1,000-foot radius like you would with a 100 watt plexi cranked up. But on the flip side of things, if you're getting your distortion from either just cranking the preamp or using a distortion pedal, then you're probably not going to want the power amp section adding more distortion to your already distorted sound. So if that's your situation, you're probably going to want to look into a higher wattage amp because it's going to give you more clean headroom. Okay, now the next 2 questions go hand in hand. And this boils down to who are you playing with and what are you playing? So you have to think, if you're just playing little cafes and the only other person in the band is like an upright bassist, well, you're going to have very different amp needs than somebody in a death metal band with a drummer who hits so hard he's breaking skins and cymbals every song. And to be honest, the drummer in your band, if you have one, is going to be the biggest determining factor. Drums don't really have a volume, so your drummer plays as hard as he does, and that's kind of the end of it. So if you show up at rehearsal and your amp is cranked and you still can't hear it over the drum kit, or say you turn off a distortion pedal and your amp is still just and you can't get a clean tone to save your life, then you need a higher wattage amp. Alright, so the last question you have to ask yourself is, where are you playing? Are you just buying the amp to play in your bedroom at home? Are you always playing shows where there's a sound guy and a wicked PA system and you don't have to worry about your amp? Or are you playing smaller venues, maybe bars and cafes where there is never a sound guy, and if you're lucky you have a PA system just to run the vocalist through and that's it. So I mean, if you're playing mostly venues where there's a sound system, then yeah, your 10 watt amp might just be more than fine. But if suddenly you find yourself playing at a club and there's no PA, well, your 10 watt amp might not cut it anymore. So really it all boils down to this. If you take your playing situations where you have to turn your amp up the loudest and you can't get a clean tone out of it to save your life, you need a higher wattage amp. On the flip side, if you can't get your amp past like 1 or 1.5 without everybody telling you to turn it the hell down, then your amp is way too loud for your needs and you should get a lower wattage amp. Now I want to give you all a couple of recommendations just before we wrap this up. We all know every tube amp is going to have its sweet spot, where it sounds the best, where everything just sounds awesome coming out of it. So if you always want to keep your amp in that sweet spot no matter where you're playing, I would highly recommend some type of power attenuator. Could be something as simple as like a Bulgara PS1, or something crazy like the Universal Audio aux box. Now we'll get more into attenuation in another video, but basically an attenuator will allow you to crank the amp head up as loud as you want to get everything in that sweet spot, but give you full or almost full control over how much volume is actually coming out of the speaker cabinet. And then the last thing I'd recommend before buying a new amp, if you have the option, see if you can possibly rent or borrow the amp from the store you're looking to buy it from, or if you know somebody who has the same amp, see if you can borrow it. This way you'll have the option to be able to try it out at, a show or band rehearsal or whatever you gotta do, and that'll let you know right away whether you need a higher wattage or a lower wattage amplifier. So anyway, I hope those questions will help you find a better amplifier that's more suited to your needs. As always, I've been Mr. Jeff, so thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take it easy.